Who authorized this man to board my ship? The words cut across the flight deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt like a blade through morning fog. Rear Admiral Preston Whitmore III stood with his shoulders squared and his jaw tight, every inch of his dress whites immaculate beneath the California sun. His eyes fixed on the figure near the stern with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something scraped off the bottom of a boot. The old man stood alone by the safety netting, trying to make himself small. His peacoat hung 3 sizes too large, the sleeves swallowing his weathered hands, patches held together with safety pins that caught the light. His white beard had yellowed at the edges, and his face carried the deep creases of a man who had spent too many nights sleeping under open sky. He was 74 years old, though he looked older. The kind of old that comes not just from years, but from carrying weight that never lightens. His name was Earl Vance Beaumont, and he had not stood on a Navy vessel in 18 years. Admiral Whitmore crossed the deck with his aide, Lieutenant Commander Yates, trailing 2 steps behind. Around them, sailors in dress whites moved with purpose, arranging chairs in precise rows, adjusting microphone stands, preparing for the change of command ceremony that would begin in less than an hour. News cameras would arrive soon. Dignitaries were already gathering at the gangway. Everything had to be perfect. Everything except the homeless man contaminating his flight deck. Whitmore stopped 6 feet from Beaumont, close enough to make his presence oppressive, but far enough to avoid any possibility of contact. His voice carried across the deck, deliberately loud, meant to be heard by every sailor within earshot. "I asked a question," he said. "Who authorized this vagrant to board my vessel?" Lieutenant Reyes stepped forward. The chaplain was young, barely 30, her face tight with concern. "Sir," she said, "I invited him through the Veteran Outreach Program. He is a veteran, Admiral. I thought perhaps a day aboard ship might help him remember who he used to be." Whitmore turned his gaze on her with withering contempt. You thought it would be appropriate to bring a man who clearly cannot care for himself onto a nuclear aircraft carrier during one of the most important ceremonies of the year. You thought the families of distinguished officers should be greeted by the sight of someone who looks like he crawled out of a dumpster. Beaumont watched this exchange in silence. His hands hung loose at his sides, but something in his posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. A straightening of the spine, a settling of weight into his heels. The kind of adjustment a man makes without thinking when he has spent decades standing at attention. Sir, Beaumont said quietly. His voice was soft, hoarse from disuse, but steady. "I apologize for causing any trouble. I was invited, but if my presence is a problem, I will go. I meant no disrespect." Whitmore laughed, a short, sharp sound without warmth. "Disrespect? You standing on my deck in that condition is disrespect." He gestured at Beaumont's appearance, the frayed edges, the worn boots with steel toes showing through cracked leather. "This is the United States Navy, not a homeless shelter. Whatever fairy tale you told the chaplain to get yourself aboard, the invitation was clearly a mistake." Beaumont nodded slowly. He did not argue, did not defend himself. His eyes, pale blue and tired beyond measure, simply accepted the judgment as if he had heard it 1,000 times before. "I understand, sir. I will leave." He turned toward the gangway, but Whitmore was not finished. "Wait," the Admiral said. His eyes had landed on Beaumont's chest, where a chain disappeared beneath the threadbare collar of his shirt. "What is that? Around your neck?" Beaumont paused. His hand moved unconsciously toward his collar, but stopped short of touching it. "My dog tags, sir." Whitmore's expression twisted into something between amusement and contempt. "Dog tags? Let me guess. You bought them at a surplus store for $5. Thought they would make your story more believable." He shook his head and addressed the gathering sailors. "This is what we're dealing with now. Stolen valor has become an epidemic. Every vagrant on the street claims they were special forces, claims they were decorated heroes. It is pathetic." Several sailors shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Beaumont stood perfectly still. When he spoke, his voice had not changed in volume, but something beneath it had hardened, like steel wrapped in velvet. "I have never stolen anything in my life, Admiral." He paused, especially not valor. Whitmore stepped closer. Then you would not mind removing them, proving they are real. Because I have seen 100 men like you claiming service you never gave, claiming sacrifice you never made. What I see standing before me is someone who gave up on himself and expects the rest of us to carry him. The flight deck had grown quiet. Sailors pretending to work were watching from their peripheral vision. The chaplain looked stricken. Lieutenant Commander Yates stood rigid, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to contradict his superior. Beaumont met Whitmore's gaze. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Beaumont spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You are right about one thing, Admiral. I did give up on myself. A long time ago, but not for the reasons you think. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. Whitmore waved his hand dismissively. I do not have time for this. Yates, escort this man off my ship. Immediately, before the cameras arrive. Lieutenant Commander Yates moved forward and took Beaumont gently by the arm. This way, sir, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I will walk you to the gangway. Beaumont allowed himself to be led. He did not resist, did not protest. His compliance was absolute, the surrender of a man who had long ago stopped believing he deserved anything else. But what Admiral Whitmore could not know, what none of them standing on that flight deck could possibly understand, was that the weathered old man being escorted away like refuse had walked these decks before Whitmore was born. He had earned his trident in waters that would make the Admiral weep. He had carried his dying brother out of fire and sand while the Admiral was still learning to tie his shoes. And in exactly 43 minutes, Rear Admiral Preston Whitmore III would learn exactly what it meant to stand in the presence of a ghost. 6 hours earlier, Earl Vance Beaumont had opened his eyes to the underside of the Coronado Bridge. The concrete above him was stained with decades of exhaust and salt air, a canvas of gray and brown that he knew as intimately as he had once known the ceiling of his bedroom in the house he shared with Loretta. He lay still for a long moment, letting his body remember where it was, letting the ache in his joints settle into something manageable. 74 years old, for years on the streets. Some mornings, the math of that still surprised him. He sat up slowly, his sleeping bag rustling against the cardboard he used as a mattress. The morning air off San Diego Bay carried the smell of salt and diesel, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the particular scent of a naval base. Paint and jet fuel and purpose. He had lived within walking distance of that smell for 4 years now, close enough to watch the ships come and go, close enough to hear the cadence calls drifting across the water on still mornings when the BUD/S candidates were running the beach. Some days, he could swear he heard his own voice among them. A younger voice, a voice that still believed in things. Earl folded his sleeping bag with the precision that 50 years of muscle memory demanded. Hospital corners, tight rolls, everything in its place. His hands moved automatically while his mind drifted somewhere far away, somewhere the sun was hotter, and the sand was not the sand of California beaches, but the sand of a desert that had swallowed 8 good men on an April night in 1980. He reached for his rucksack and checked its contents the way he did every morning. The inventory never changed, but the ritual mattered. Loretta's wedding ring on a thin, silver chain, the metal worn smooth from years of his thumb rubbing across it. A photograph of her laughing on their porch in Virginia Beach, her hair caught by the wind, her eyes holding a joy he had not seen anywhere since the cancer took her. 2 sets of dog tags, his own and another pair, so worn the letters were nearly illegible. And a Bible, small enough to fit in a cargo pocket, its pages soft with age and handling, filled with handwriting that was not his own. Earl opened the Bible to a random page and found a passage underlined in faded pencil. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Ronnie Carver had underlined that passage 3 days before they loaded onto the helicopters for Operation Eagle Claw. 3 days before the collision at Desert One. 3 days before Earl watched his best friend die in his arms on Iranian sand while the world burned around them. He closed the Bible and pressed it against his forehead. "Still here, brother," he whispered. "Still trying." The memory came uninvited, the way it always did. The staging area in the Iranian desert. The helicopters landing in clouds of dust. The C-130 tanker aircraft waiting to refuel them for the push to Tehran. Everything going according to plan until it wasn't. Until a helicopter drifted into the tanker during repositioning. Until the fireball lit up the night and turned the sand to glass. Earl had been 30 feet away when the collision happened. The blast threw him backward, and when he regained his feet, the world was chaos. Fire everywhere. Men screaming. Ammunition cooking off in the flames. And somewhere in that inferno, Ronnie Carver was trapped under debris that had been a helicopter rotor assembly moments before. Protocol said to evacuate. Protocol said the mission was compromised, and every second on the ground increased the risk of discovery. Protocol said to leave the dead and save the living. Earl had never been good at protocol. He found Ronnie pinned beneath twisted metal, flames licking closer with every heartbeat. Ronnie's legs were crushed. His flight suit was burning. And still, he looked up at Earl with those calm Alabama eyes and said the words that would haunt Earl for the rest of his life. "Go, preacher. Save yourself. I'm already gone." Earl did not go. He grabbed the metal and pulled until his hands bled and his shoulders screamed and the hair on his arms singed away. He dragged Ronnie free and beat out the flames with his bare palms and carried him toward the extraction point while the world collapsed around them. Ronnie died somewhere in those endless yards of burning sand. His last words were the Lord's Prayer, whispered through lips that were already turning blue. And Earl kept walking, kept carrying, refused to leave him behind, even when the commanders screamed at him to drop the body and move. They had to physically separate them at the extraction aircraft. 3 men pulling Earl away while he fought like a wounded animal to stay with his brother. He never forgave himself for surviving. Never forgave himself for the half-second delay that put Ronnie closer to the collision than him. Never forgave himself for being the one who walked out of Iran while 8 men stayed behind in flag-draped boxes. The decades after were a blur of deployments and operations and training cycles. Earl threw himself into every mission as if daring death to take him the way it should have taken him at Desert One. But death was not interested. Death let him earn 3 Bronze Stars and 2 Purple Hearts and a Navy Cross for an operation that still did not exist in official records. Death let him train a generation of SEALs and watch them go off to wars he was too old to fight. Death let him retire with full honors and build a quiet life with Loretta in a house with a porch where they watched sunsets and pretended the nightmares would eventually stop. Then Loretta got sick, and then Loretta died. And Earl discovered that there were some wounds even 32 years of combat could not prepare you for. He lasted 6 months in the house that smelled like her perfume. 6 months of waking up reaching for her side of the bed. 6 months of cooking dinner for 2 before remembering there was only 1. Then he signed the house over to his daughter Margaret, who was struggling with her own demons, and he walked away from everything. He told himself he was giving her a fresh start. Told himself she would be better off without a broken old man haunting her halls. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He could not look at Margaret without seeing Loretta's eyes. Could not hear her voice without hearing echoes of the woman he had failed to save. So he disappeared, became a ghost, found his way to Coronado, because some part of him needed to be close to the place where he had become someone worth being, even if that someone was gone now. The invitation had come through the shelter chaplain 3 days ago. A young Navy lieutenant named Reyes, who volunteered on weekends, had mentioned a ceremony aboard the Roosevelt. A change of command. She thought it might help Earl to be among sailors again, to remember what it felt like to belong to something larger than himself. He had almost said no, almost retreated into the comfortable numbness of routine. But something in him, some ember that refused to die completely, had whispered yes. Now he pulled on his boots, the leather cracked and the steel toes exposed, and began the four-meal walk to the naval base. The morning sun warmed his face as he moved through streets that grew cleaner and more prosperous with every block. By the time he reached the gate, he looked exactly like what he was. A vagrant, a castaway, a man the world had forgotten. But beneath the threadbare coat and the yellowed beard, beneath the trembling hands and the tired eyes, something else waited. Something forged in fire and blood and loss. Something that had never truly died, no matter how hard he had tried to bury it. Earl Vance Beaumont walked toward the ship that would change everything, and he had no idea that the next few hours would drag him back from the grave he had dug for himself. Lieutenant Commander Yates guided Earl across the flight deck with a grip that was firm but not unkind. The younger officer kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, clearly uncomfortable with the task he had been assigned, but unwilling to contradict an admiral in front of the assembled crew. Earl walked without resistance. His boots, held together with hope and habit, made soft sounds against the non-skid surface of the deck. Around them, sailors continued their preparations with studied indifference, though Earl could feel their eyes tracking him. The homeless man being escorted off the ship, the embarrassment being removed before the cameras arrived. He understood. He had been one of them once, decades ago, standing watch on decks like this one while officers made decisions above his pay grade. The Navy was a hierarchy, and hierarchies did not bend for broken old men in borrowed coats. They were halfway to the gangway when the first complication arose. A convoy of black SUVs had arrived at the pier, and a stream of VIPs was ascending the gangway in a procession of dress uniforms and civilian finery. Wives in sundresses and pearls. Retired officers with chests full of ribbons. Family members clutching programs and cameras. The outgoing commanding officer's guests, arriving early to secure good seats for the ceremony. Yates pulled Earl to the side, pressing them both against the equipment locker to let the procession pass. His grip on Earl's arm tightened slightly, a silent command to remain still and invisible. Earl watched the VIPs file past. Most did not notice him at all, their attention fixed on the impressive vessel around them, on finding their assigned seats, on the excitement of the occasion. But a few glances away, their expressions shifting through confusion to distaste to deliberate disregard. One woman in a cream-colored dress physically stepped wider to avoid passing too close to him, as if poverty might be contagious. Among the procession, Earl noticed an older man walking with a cane. He was white-haired and weathered, late 70s at least, wearing a civilian suit with a single pin on his lapel. Something about the way he carried himself, the economy of movement despite the cane, caught Earl's attention. The man moved like someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform, someone for whom the absence of insignia did not diminish the authority beneath. Their eyes met briefly as the man passed. Earl saw a recognition flicker there, not of him specifically, but of something, a question forming behind intelligent eyes. Then the moment passed, and the man continued up the deck toward the VIP seating area. Yates waited until the procession cleared before resuming their march toward the gangway. But they had not gone 10 steps when Admiral Whitmore's voice crackled over the deck. "Yates, hold position." The lieutenant commander stopped immediately, turning to face the admiral who was striding toward them with barely contained fury. Behind him, a civilian with a news camera was setting up near the podium, adjusting angles and checking light levels. Whitmore reached them and spoke in a low, vicious tone. "The media is here early. I will not have footage of a vagrant being removed from my ship playing on the evening news." He glared at Earl as if this were somehow his fault. "Take him below. Hold him in one of the storage compartments until the ceremony begins. Then remove him through the service gangway on the port side. Out of sight." "Sir," Yates said carefully, "would it not be simpler to just let him leave now, before the cameras are fully operational?" Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my orders, Lieutenant Commander?" "No, sir." "Then do as I say. I want him invisible until this ceremony is over. After that, I do not care if he walks into the bay and drowns." Earl absorbed the words without visible reaction. He had heard worse, had been called worse. After 4 years on the streets, the cruelty of comfortable people had lost its power to wound him. What remained was only a dull recognition of how far he had fallen from the man he used to be. Yates saluted and redirected Earl toward a hatch that led below decks. They descended a ladder into the ship's interior, leaving the sunlight and salt air behind. The passageways were narrow, painted gray and white, lined with pipes and cables that hummed with the vessel's systems. Earl's hand brushed against the bulkhead as he walked, feeling the vibration of the ship's reactors through the steel. 50 years ago, he had walked passageways just like these aboard the USS Grayback, a submarine converted for special operations. He had been young then, lean and hungry, fresh from BUD/S with the trident still shiny on his chest. He remembered the cramped quarters, the smell of hydraulic fluid and recycled air, the brotherhood of men who lived and trained and bled together in spaces too small for secrets. Now he walked these passageways as a prisoner being hidden away. The irony was not lost on him. They reached a storage compartment near the crew mess. Yates opened the door and gestured for Earl to enter. Inside were crates of supplies, cleaning equipment, folded chairs stacked against the bulkhead. A single overhead light cast harsh shadows across the space. "Wait here," Yates said. His voice had lost some of its official edge. "Someone will come for you when the ceremony is underway." Earl nodded and stepped inside. He turned to face the lieutenant commander, and something in his expression made the younger man pause. "Thank you," Earl said quietly, "for not being cruel about it." Yates hesitated. His eyes dropped to the chain around Earl's neck, the dog tags hidden beneath his shirt. For a moment, something like doubt crossed his features. Then he straightened and closed the door without another word. Earl stood alone in the storage compartment, surrounded by the mundane necessities of naval life. He could hear footsteps in the passageway outside, voices calling out orders, the distant thrum of activity as the ship prepared for ceremony. He was beneath the flight deck now, beneath the VIPs and the cameras and the Admiral who had dismissed him as garbage. He found a crate sturdy enough to support his weight and sat down slowly, his joints protesting the movement. From his rucksack, he withdrew Ronnie's Bible and held it in his hands without opening it. The leather cover was warm from being pressed against his body, soft from decades of handling. "I almost made it, Ronnie," he whispered to the empty room. Almost stood on a deck again. Almost remembered what it felt like. The ship hummed around him, alive with purpose and power. And Earl Vance Beaumont sat in the darkness below, forgotten by everyone except the ghosts who never left his side. But somewhere above him, on the flight deck filling with dignitaries and cameras, a young petty officer named Diana Okonkwo was staring at her phone, scrolling through archived photographs from the Naval Special Warfare Database. She had seen something on the old man's arm when his sleeve rode up. A trident, coordinates, a date, and she could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Petty Officer Second Class Diana Okonkwo had served as a corpsman attached to SEAL Team 7 support for 3 years. In that time, she had learned to read the men she worked with in ways that went beyond medical charts and vital signs. She knew the way operators carried themselves, the particular economy of movement that came from years of training the body to be a weapon. She knew the 1,000-yard stare that flickered across their faces when something triggered a memory they would never speak aloud. She knew the tattoos. The tattoos were a language unto themselves. Every frogman she had ever treated carried ink that told stories. Tridents earned in blood and salt water. Coordinates of operations that changed them forever. Dates that marked the worst days of their lives. Names and initials of brothers who did not come home. The men rarely explained their tattoos, but Diana had learned to read them like medical histories written on skin. When the old man's sleeve had ridden up during the confrontation with Admiral Whitmore, she had seen only a flash, a glimpse of faded ink on weathered skin. But that glimpse had burned itself into her memory with the clarity of a photograph. A trident, old style, the kind they inked in the 70s and 80s before the designs became more elaborate. Coordinates beneath it, numbers she had not been able to read completely. A date, and something else, letters that might have been initials. Now she stood near the VIP seating area, her phone in her hand, scrolling through the Naval Special Warfare historical archives that were publicly accessible online. She was looking for something she could not name, driven by an instinct she could not explain. The coordinates. She had caught only partial numbers, but the format was unmistakable. Degrees north and east. Somewhere in the Middle East, if she had to guess. The date had been clearer. August 3rd, 1980. She typed the date into her search along with the words Navy SEAL Operation. The results that populated her screen made her breath catch. Operation Eagle Claw. The failed mission to rescue American hostages from Iran. April 24th, 1980. 8 servicemen killed at a staging site called Desert One when a helicopter collided with a C-130 tanker aircraft. But the date on the old man's arm had been August, not April. She refined her search, adding the month, and found references to classified follow-up operations that had never been officially acknowledged. Reconnaissance missions, recovery operations, actions that existed only in rumors and declassified fragments. Diana looked up from her phone toward the hatch where the old man had been taken below. Her heart was beating faster now, a rhythm of uncertainty and growing conviction. She spotted Lieutenant Reyes near the chaplain station and made her way through the gathering crowd. The young chaplain looked shaken, her eyes red-rimmed, clearly distressed by what had happened to the veteran she had invited aboard. "Lieutenant," Diana said quietly, "the man who was just removed. What do you know about him?" Reyes shook her head. "Not much. He comes to the shelter sometimes. Never asks for anything, never causes trouble. He mentioned once that he served, but he never talks about it. I thought bringing him here might help him reconnect with something." "Did he ever mention his rate? His unit? Anything specific about his service?" "No." Reyes paused, thinking, but there was something about him. The way he moved, the way he spoke. Like everything he did was deliberate, controlled. "I volunteer with a lot of veterans, petty officer. Most of them are open about their service, sometimes too open. But this man, he kept everything locked away. Like he was protecting something, or hiding from something," Diana murmured. She thanked the chaplain and moved away, her mind racing. The trident tattoo alone meant nothing. Anyone could get ink. Stolen valor was real, and Admiral Whitmore's suspicion was not unfounded. But the style of that trident, the age of it, the way it had faded into the old man's skin like it had been there for half a century, that was harder to fake. And then there was the way he had stood. The way he had absorbed the Admiral's abuse without flinching, without defending himself, but also without breaking. Diana had seen that posture before. It was the posture of men who had endured things that made public humiliation feel like a gentle breeze. She made a decision. Vice Admiral Montgomery Pierce was seated in the front row of the VIP section, his cane propped against his chair, his attention fixed on the program in his hands. Diana knew him by reputation. 30 years in naval special warfare. Commander of SEAL teams during some of the most intense operations of the Cold War era. A legend among the special operations community, now retired but still consulted on matters of training and doctrine. She approached his aide, a young lieutenant commander who stood at the edge of the VIP section with a clipboard and an earpiece. "Excuse me, sir," Diana said. "I need to ask Vice Admiral Pierce a question. It is important." The aide looked at her with the polite condescension reserved for enlisted personnel who did not understand protocol. "The Admiral is preparing for the ceremony. Whatever you need can wait." Diana held her ground. "It concerned a veteran who was just removed from the ship. I think there may have been a mistake." The aide's expression did not change. "I am sure Admiral Whitmore handled the situation appropriately." "Please," Diana said. She lowered her voice. "I saw a tattoo on the man's arm. A trident with coordinates that match a location in Iran. The date August 3rd, 1980. I think he might be genuine, and I think Vice Admiral Pierce might be able to confirm it." Something shifted in the aide's eyes. The date, the location. These were not random details. These were specific enough to matter. He studied Diana for a long moment, then turned and bent to whisper in Vice Admiral Pierce's ear. The old admiral listened, his expression unchanging. Then he looked up, his eyes finding Diana across the crowded deck. He gestured for her to approach. Diana walked to the front row on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. She stopped before the vice admiral and came to attention, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing a retired flag officer in a situation like this. Pierce waved away the formality. At ease, petty officer. He studied her face with eyes that had seen more than she could imagine. Tell me about this tattoo. Diana described what she had seen. The trident, the partial coordinates, the date, the initials. She described the old man's bearing, his quiet dignity, the way he had responded to Admiral Whitmore's cruelty without crumbling. Pierce listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. His hand had moved to grip the head of his cane, knuckles whitening. August 3rd, 1980, he said softly. Do you know what happened on that date, petty officer? No, sir. I cannot find anything specific in the public records. Pierce nodded slowly. You would not. He looked toward the hatch that led below decks, his eyes distant. Where is this man now? Below decks, sir. Admiral Whitmore ordered him held in a storage compartment until after the ceremony. Pierce's jaw tightened. Something cold and hard moved behind his eyes. He turned to his aide. Find out exactly where they are holding him, he said, and bring me there. Now. The aide hesitated. Sir, the ceremony begins in 20 minutes. Pierce rose from his chair, gripping his cane with the authority of a man who had commanded warriors. The ceremony can wait. If this man is who I think he might be, we have made a terrible mistake, and I will not let it stand 1 minute longer than necessary. Above decks, the flight deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt had transformed into a theater of naval tradition. White chairs filled with dignitaries stretched in precise rows toward the podium. The American flag snapped in the Pacific breeze alongside the Navy Jack and the ship's battle ensign. A Navy band had assembled near the island superstructure, their instruments gleaming in the late morning sun. Admiral Preston Whitmore stood at the center of it all, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had orchestrated perfection. The cameras were in position. The VIPs were seated. The outgoing and incoming commanding officers waited in the wings, their families arranged in the front rows with practice smiles. Everything was proceeding according to his meticulous plan. The homeless vagrant was hidden away below decks, invisible and irrelevant. A minor disruption, handled with appropriate decisiveness. Whitmore allowed himself a small smile as he reviewed his opening remarks one final time. He did not notice Vice Admiral Pierce rise from his seat in the VIP section. Did not see the old warrior make his way toward the hatch that led below, his aide clearing a path through the crowd. Did not register that one of the most decorated special operations commanders in naval history had just abandoned the ceremony he had been invited to attend. Whitmore's attention was fixed on the cameras, on the assembled brass, on the legacy he was building with every perfectly executed event. He had never served in combat, had risen through administrative channels and staff positions, had earned his stars through efficiency reports and political navigation rather than blood and sacrifice. But he wore the uniform with pride, and he guarded its image with the zealotry of a man who understood that perception was power. The ceremony would begin in 15 minutes. Everything was under control. Below decks, Earl Beaumont sat alone in the storage compartment, listening to the muffled sounds of activity above him. He could hear footsteps on the deck overhead, the distant murmur of voices, the occasional bark of an order being relayed. The ship was alive around him, humming with purpose, and he was a stone lodged in its machinery, waiting to be expelled. He had opened Ronnie's Bible to the book of Isaiah, reading words he had read 1,000 times before. But the familiar verses brought no comfort today. His mind kept returning to the flight deck, to the Admiral's contempt, to the faces of the sailors who had watched him being led away like a criminal. He had known this would happen, had known from the moment he accepted the chaplain's invitation that he did not belong among these people anymore. The Navy he had served no longer existed. The men he had fought beside were dead or scattered or forgotten. He was a relic of a different era, a ghost haunting spaces that had moved on without him. And yet some part of him had hoped. Some small, stubborn ember had believed that standing on a deck again might rekindle something that had gone cold inside him. That the smell of the sea and the sight of sailors in uniform might remind him that his life had meant something once. Instead, he had been reminded of what he had become. A vagrant, a burden, a man so broken that even his own daughter did not know if he was alive or dead. The hatch to the compartment opened without warning. Earl looked up, expecting to see Lieutenant Commander Yates or some junior sailor sent to escort him off the ship. Instead, he saw an old man with white hair and a cane, dressed in a civilian suit with a single pin on his lapel. Behind him stood a young officer and a petty officer in medical insignia, both watching with expressions of barely contained anticipation. The old man stepped into the compartment. His eyes swept the space, taking in the crates and equipment, before settling on Earl with an intensity that made the air feel suddenly heavy. Earl rose slowly from his crate, an instinct older than thought bringing him to his feet in the presence of what his body recognized even before his mind caught up. Authority, command, the particular gravity of a man who had led warriors into darkness and brought them back into light. The old man studied Earl's face for a long moment. Decades of sun and hardship had changed him, carved new lines and stolen the sharp edges of youth. But something remained, something in the set of the jaw, the pale blue eyes, the way he held himself even in rags and ruin. "What was your BUD/S class?" the old man asked quietly. The question hit Earl like a physical blow. He had not been asked that question in years, had not spoken those words aloud since the last time he stood among men who understood what they meant. "Class 52, sir," he heard himself say. The words came automatically, pulled from a depth he had thought was sealed forever. 1967. The old man's breath caught audibly. Graduation rate. 19 of 164, sir. Silence filled the compartment. The young officer and the petty officer exchanged glances, uncertain what they were witnessing, but sensing its weight. The old man took another step closer. His voice had changed, grown softer and more urgent. There was an operator from that class. They called him Preacher. Best sniper naval special warfare ever produced in that era. Carried a Bible that belonged to his swim buddy who died at Desert One. Earl said nothing. His hand moved unconsciously toward his rucksack, toward the Bible that waited inside like a heart that had never stopped beating. The old man continued, his words coming faster now. "I was commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 1 when that man retired in 1999. I pinned his third Bronze Star myself. I sat with his wife at the ceremony, a woman named Loretta who laughed like music and looked at him like he hung the stars." Earl's composure cracked. A sound escaped him, something between a breath and a sob, a noise he had not made in years. The old man's eyes were wet now, his voice breaking on the words. "That man was one of the finest warriors I ever had the privilege of serving alongside. His call sign was Preacher because he would lead a quiet prayer before every operation, reading from a Bible that belonged to a man named Ronald Carver who died in his arms at Desert One. He stepped closer still, close enough to touch, his cane forgotten at his side. And if you were telling me that man is sitting in a storage compartment on this ship, being hidden away like garbage, while an admiral who never heard a shot fired in anger presides over a ceremony above us." His voice broke completely. "Master Chief Beaumont." "Earl, is that you?" Earl Beaumont stood frozen in the dim light of the storage compartment, his chest tight with something he had not felt in years. Recognition, not the casual acknowledgement of a face in a crowd, but the deep recognition of being truly seen by someone who understood exactly what that seeing meant. "Admiral Pierce," he said. His voice cracked on the name. "It has been a long time, sir." Pierce crossed the remaining distance between them and gripped Earl's shoulders with hands that trembled. 18 years, Earl. We thought you were dead. Your daughter filed a missing persons report 5 years ago. The Navy Times ran a story. Veterans groups organized searches along the West Coast. Earl's face contorted with something between grief and shame. He tried to pull away, but Pierce held him firm. "My daughter," Earl whispered. "Margaret." She never stopped looking. Pierce's voice was fierce now, the command authority of decades cutting through the emotion. "She contacted every VA hospital, every homeless shelter, every veterans organization from San Diego to Seattle. She hired private investigators. She begged the Navy to help track you down through your service records." Earl shook his head slowly, his eyes dropping to the deck. "I did not want to be found, sir. After Loretta died, I could not stay. I could not look at Margaret without seeing her mother's eyes. I thought I was protecting her by leaving. I thought she would be better off without a broken old man haunting her life." Pierce's grip tightened. "Protecting her? Earl, that girl has spent 5 years not knowing if her father was alive or dead. She lights a candle for you every Sunday at church. She named her son after you, a boy you have never met, because she wanted some part of you to exist in the world even if you were gone." The words landed like blows. Earl's knees buckled slightly, and Pierce steadied him, guiding him back to the crate he had been sitting on. The petty officer, Okonkwo, stepped forward instinctively, her medical training responding to a man in distress. But Pierce waved her back with a small gesture. "I have a grandson," Earl said. The words came out hollow, disbelieving. "Earl Thomas Beaumont, Jr. He is 4 years old, shark crazy, according to Margaret. Wants to be a Navy diver when he grows up because his grandfather was a hero." Earl pressed his palms against his eyes, his shoulders shaking. The dam he had built over 4 years of silence and isolation was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Pierce knelt beside him, ignoring the protest of his own aged joints. "I need you to listen to me, Earl. What you did, leaving like that, it was wrong. It was selfish. It caused pain to people who love you more than you apparently understand." Earl nodded without looking up, accepting the rebuke. "But," Pierce continued, his voice softening, "I also know what it is like to carry weight that never gets lighter. I know what it is like to wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for brothers who are not there anymore. I know what Desert One cost you. I know what losing Loretta must have done to a man who had already lost so much." He paused, letting the words settle. "You are not garbage, Earl. You are not a vagrant or a burden or whatever other lies you have been telling yourself for 4 years. You are a Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy. You are a SEAL who served with more distinction than most men can dream of. You are a father and now a grandfather. And you're coming with me to that flight deck right now." Earl looked up, his eyes red and wet. "Sir, I cannot. Look at me. I'm not fit to stand among those people. I would only embarrass everyone." Pierce stood and straightened his jacket. The only person who embarrassed anyone today was Admiral Whitmore when he treated a decorated war hero like trash to be disposed of. "And I intend to correct that mistake immediately." He extended his hand to Earl. "On your feet, Master Chief. That is not a request." Earl stared at the offered hand. Decades of conditioning, of obedience to command, of trusting the men who led him warred against years of self-imposed exile and shame. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The chain of command, the brotherhood, the unbreakable bonds forged in blood and salt water. Slowly, he reached up and took Pierce's hand. The Vice Admiral pulled him to his feet with surprising strength for a man of 78. For a moment, they stood face to face, two old warriors who had survived wars that younger men could not imagine, who had buried brothers and carried scars that would never fully heal. Pierce nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. "There he is," he said quietly. "There is the preacher I remember." He turned to his aide. "Lieutenant Commander, find out exactly where Admiral Whitmore is. We're going to have a conversation he will never forget." "Sir," the aide said carefully, "the ceremony is about to begin. The cameras are rolling. If we interrupt now, it will be public. Very public." Pierce's expression hardened into something that made even Earl straighten instinctively. "Good," he said. "Some lessons are best learned in front of witnesses." He looked at Earl and gestured toward the hatch. "After you, Master Chief. It is time to remind Admiral Whitmore what the Navy is supposed to stand for." Earl hesitated for just a moment. Then something shifted in his posture. The hunch of his shoulders straightened. His chin lifted. His eyes, which had been dull and defeated for so long, flickered with a light that had never quite died, no matter how hard he had tried to extinguish it. He walked toward the hatch with steps that grew steadier with each stride, moving through passageways that suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a path back to something he had lost. Behind him, Pierce followed with his cane tapping against the deck, and Okonkwo fell in a step beside the aide, all of them moving together toward a confrontation that would change everything. Above them, the ceremony was beginning. Admiral Whitmore had taken the podium, his voice carrying across the flight deck with practiced authority. He had no idea what was climbing toward him from the depths of his own ship. The ladder leading up to the flight deck stretched above Earl like a threshold between two worlds. Below was the darkness he had inhabited for 4 years, the comfortable anonymity of being no one, expecting nothing, deserving nothing. Above was light and ceremony and the terrifying possibility of being seen again by people who might remember who he used to be. His hands gripped the rungs, feeling the cold metal against palms that had once held rifles and ropes and the dying body of his best friend. Behind him, Pierce waited with patient authority, saying nothing, letting Earl make the choice to climb on his own terms. Earl thought of Margaret, of the candles she lit every Sunday, of the little boy named after him who dreamed of being a Navy diver, of all the years he had stolen from them because he believed his absence was a gift rather than a wound. He thought of Loretta, of what she would say if she could see him now. She had never let him hide from hard things, had never let him use his pain as an excuse to stop living. She would have dragged him up this ladder herself, probably with a few choice words about self-pity and the waste of a good man. He thought of Ronnie Carver, of the last words whispered through dying lips. Go, preacher. Save yourself. For 45 years, Earl had interpreted those words as permission to survive when his brother could not. But standing at the bottom of this ladder, he wondered if Ronnie had meant something more. Not just save yourself from the fire. Save yourself from everything that comes after. Save yourself from the guilt and the grief and the slow surrender to despair. Maybe saving himself meant climbing this ladder. Maybe it meant facing the light instead of hiding in the dark. Maybe it meant accepting that he still had something to offer, even now, even broken, even old. Earl began to climb. Each rung brought him closer to the flight deck, closer to the sounds of the ceremony in progress. He could hear Admiral Whitmore's voice carrying across the open air, speaking about tradition and honor and the sacred responsibility of command. The words sounded hollow to Earl, the rhetoric of a man who had never tested those concepts against the reality of combat. He reached the top of the ladder and emerged through the hatch into blinding California sunlight. For a moment, he stood blinking, letting his eyes adjust, feeling the Pacific wind against his face like a baptism. The flight deck spread before him in all its ceremonial glory. Rows of white chairs filled with dignitaries and family members. The Navy band silent now, instruments at rest. Cameras pointed at the podium where Whitmore stood mid-speech, gesturing with practiced emphasis. The outgoing and incoming commanding officers waited at attention nearby, their families watching from the front row. No one had noticed Earl's emergence yet. He stood near the edge of the assembly, partially obscured by an equipment station, watching the ceremony unfold from the margins where he had learned to exist. Pierce climbed up behind him, followed by the aide and Okonkwo. The vice admiral moved to stand beside Earl, his cane planted firmly on the deck, his eyes fixed on Whitmore with an expression that promised reckoning. Not yet, Pierce murmured. Let him finish his sentence. Then we move. Earl nodded slightly, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was acutely aware of his appearance. The oversized peacoat, the worn boots, the white beard that had not seen proper trimming in months. He looked like exactly what Whitmore had called him. A vagrant, a man who did not belong. But beneath the shabby exterior, something was waking up. Something that had been dormant for 4 years, suppressed under layers of grief and guilt and self-imposed exile. His spine was straight now, his shoulders squared, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. Muscle memory older than his pain, was reasserting itself, rebuilding him from the inside out. On the podium, Whitmore was reaching the conclusion of his opening remarks. The Navy has always been built on the foundation of those who came before us, he declared, his voice rich with false reverence. We stand on the shoulders of giants, honoring their sacrifice, carrying forward their legacy of excellence. Pierce made a sound low in his throat, something between a laugh and a growl. Now, he said. He stepped forward, moving out of the shadow of the equipment station and into the open space between the seated guests and the podium. His cane struck the deck with authority, each tap announcing his approach like a drumbeat. Heads began to turn. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people recognized the white-haired figure advancing toward the ceremony. Vice Admiral Montgomery Pierce was not a man who could move anonymously through any naval gathering. His reputation preceded him like a bow wave, and the assembled officers and family members parted instinctively to let him pass. Whitmore faltered mid-sentence, his eyes finding Pierce with a mixture of confusion and irritation. The Vice Admiral was supposed to be seated in the VIP section, not striding toward the podium like a man with unfinished business. Admiral Pierce, Whitmore said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. I was not expecting you to join me at the podium. Is there something you need? Pierce stopped 10 feet from the podium and planted his cane. His voice carried across the flight deck with the command presence of a man who had led warriors into combat, while Whitmore was still learning to navigate Pentagon hallways. There is something you need, Admiral Whitmore. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the hatch where Earl still stood. You need to understand exactly who you remove from this ceremony. And you need to understand it right now, in front of every sailor and officer and camera on this deck. Whitmore's face flushed with anger. Admiral Pierce, this is highly irregular. Whatever issue you have can be addressed after the ceremony concludes. No, Pierce said. The word fell like a hammer. It cannot wait, because the man you called a vagrant, the man you ordered hidden below decks like garbage, the man whose service you mocked in front of your crew, is standing right there. He pointed toward Earl. Every head on the flight deck turned, and Earl Vance Beaumont stepped forward into the light, into the silence, into the moment that would change everything. The silence that fell over the flight deck was absolute. 300 people sat frozen in their white chairs, their eyes fixed on the old man in the threadbare peacoat who had emerged from the shadows like a specter from another age. The cameras that had been focused on Admiral Whitmore swiveled toward this new development, their operators sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Whitmore's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and fury in rapid succession. He gripped the podium with both hands, his knuckles whitening against the polished wood. Admiral Pierce, he said through clenched teeth, I do not know what you think you're doing, but this man was removed from the ceremony for legitimate security reasons. He is not a veteran. He is a homeless vagrant who somehow talked his way aboard my ship. Pierce did not respond to Whitmore. Instead, he turned to face the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the deck with the resonance of a man accustomed to being heard. I want everyone here to listen carefully to what I am about to say. He paused, letting the weight of his authority settle over the gathering. 45 years ago, 8 American servicemen died in the Iranian desert during Operation Eagle Claw, the attempt to rescue our hostages from Tehran. It was one of the darkest days in the history of special operations. A helicopter collided with a tanker aircraft at a staging site called Desert One. 8 men burned to death in the wreckage. The crowd was utterly still. Even Whitmore had stopped his protests, caught off guard by the direction Pierce had taken. Among the survivors of that disaster, Pierce continued, was a young SEAL petty officer who refused to leave his swim buddy behind. His brother, Chief Petty Officer Ronald James Carver, was trapped under burning wreckage. Protocol demanded evacuation. The fire was spreading. Every second on the ground increased the risk of the entire mission being discovered by Iranian forces. Pierce's voice tightened with emotion. But that young petty officer did not follow protocol. He went into the flames. He dragged his brother free with his bare hands while his own skin burned. And when Ronald Carver died in his arms on that Iranian sand, that young man carried his body to the extraction point. He refused to leave Iran without bringing his brother home. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several of the older veterans in attendance had straightened in their seats, their expressions shifting from curiosity to dawning recognition. That young petty officer, Pierce said, went on to serve 32 more years in naval special warfare. He earned 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, a Navy Cross for an operation that still does not exist in official records. He trained a generation of SEALs in sniper craft and combat diving. His call sign was Preacher because he would lead a quiet prayer before every operation, reading from a Bible that belonged to the brother he lost at Desert One. Pierce turned to face Whitmore directly. His name is Earl Vance Beaumont, Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, retired. /S Class 52, one of the most decorated special operators of his generation. And you, Admiral Whitmore, ordered him hidden in a storage compartment like garbage because you did not like the way he was dressed. Whitmore's face had gone pale. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Around him, the other officers on the podium had begun to shift uncomfortably, distancing themselves from the man who had suddenly become the center of a very public disaster. In the crowd, a retired captain in the third row rose slowly to his feet, then a commander beside him, then a master chief in civilian clothes who had served in Vietnam. One by one, the veterans in the audience stood, their eyes fixed on Earl with an expression that transcended rank or era. Earl remained motionless near the edge of the gathering, overwhelmed by the weight of attention he had spent 4 years avoiding. His hands trembled at his sides, but he did not retreat, could not retreat. Pierce's words had pinned him in place as surely as any order. Whitmore finally found his voice. He pointed at Earl with a shaking finger. I had no way of knowing who he was. He looked like a vagrant. He smelled like the street. How was I supposed to know he was telling the truth? Pierce's response was ice. You were supposed to treat him with basic human dignity, Admiral. You were supposed to remember that every veteran you encounter, regardless of their appearance, may have sacrificed more than you can imagine. You were supposed to ask questions before you pass judgment. Instead, you publicly humiliated a man who has given more to this Navy than you will give in your entire career. He stepped closer to the podium, his cane striking the deck with each word. You stood up there and talked about standing on the shoulders of giants, about honoring the sacrifice of those who came before. He gestured toward Earl. That man is one of those giants, Admiral, and you treated him like something to be scraped off your boot. The cameras captured everything. Every word, every expression, every moment of Whitmore's unraveling. Somewhere in the crowd, phones had emerged, recording the confrontation from multiple angles. Within hours, this footage would be everywhere. Within days, it would define Whitmore's legacy. But Earl was not thinking about cameras or legacies. He was thinking about Ronnie Carver, about the weight of a body carried through fire, about 45 years of silence finally being broken by a man he had not seen in nearly 2 decades. He was thinking about Margaret lighting candles, about a little boy named Earl who wanted to be a Navy diver. He was thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was not too late to come home. The flight deck had become a courtroom, and Admiral Whitmore stood accused before a jury of his peers. The ceremony he had orchestrated with such precision had shattered around him, replaced by something far more powerful than any change of command. This was a reckoning. Whitmore gripped the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes darted across the crowd, searching for allies, finding only faces turned away or fixed on him with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. The other officers on the platform had created subtle distance, their body language communicating what their words could not. They wanted no part of whatever was coming next. Admiral Pierce, Whitmore said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. I understand that you are upset. Perhaps I could have handled the situation differently. But this is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. We have a ceremony to complete. Pierce shook his head slowly. No, admitted. The ceremony can wait. What cannot wait is ensuring that every person on this deck understands exactly what they witnessed this morning. He turned toward Earl and extended his hand. Master Chief Beaumont, would you come forward, please? Earl hesitated. Every instinct developed over 4 years of invisibility screamed at him to retreat, to disappear back through the hatch and return to the shadows where he belonged. But Pierce's hand remained extended, steady and patient, and behind it stood the weight of a lifetime of service that demanded one thing above all else. You do not leave a brother behind. Earl walked forward. His boots, held together with hope and friction, carried him across the non-skid surface of the flight deck. The crowd parted before him, people rising from their seats or stepping aside to clear his path. He could feel their eyes on him, hundreds of gazes tracking his progress, but he kept his focus on Pierce's outstretched hand. When he reached the Vice Admiral, Pierce gripped his hand firmly and then did something that sent a ripple of murmurs through the assembled crowd. He came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Master Chief," he said, "it is an honor to stand with you again." Earl's hand rose automatically, muscle memory overriding years of dormancy. He returned the salute with a precision that surprised even himself, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. "The honor is mine, Admiral," he said quietly. "It always was." Pierce held the salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. Then he turned back to face Whitmore and the crowd. "I want to tell you about this man's tattoo," he said. The one Admiral Whitmore dismissed as something purchased at a surplus store. He gestured toward Earl's left arm. "Master Chief, if you would." Earl understood what was being asked. He shrugged off the oversized peacoat, letting it fall to the deck behind him. Beneath it, he wore a faded flannel shirt with sleeves that had been rolled up against the morning warmth. On his left forearm, the tattoo was clearly visible. The crowd pressed closer, those in the back standing on chairs to see. Pierce stepped beside Earl and pointed to the ink that had been etched into his skin nearly half a century ago. "This is an original trident," he said. "The design they used in the late 60s and early 70s, before the modern version was standardized. You cannot buy this at a surplus store. You cannot fake the way the ink has settled into the skin over 5 decades." He traced the coordinates beneath the trident. These numbers: 34.5253 degrees north, 69.1725 degrees east. These are not random coordinates. This is the location of Desert One, the exact spot where 8 American servicemen died on April 24th, 1980. His finger moved to the date. August 3rd, 1980. This is the date of a classified recovery operation that brought home remains and equipment from that disaster. An operation that officially never happened. An operation that Master Chief Beaumont volunteered for despite having barely recovered from the burns he sustained saving his swim buddy 3 months earlier. The crowd was utterly silent. Even Whitmore had stopped his protests, his face ashen as the magnitude of his error became undeniable. Pierce pointed to the initials beneath the date. "RJC Ronald James Carver," he said softly. "The brother who died in Earl's arms. The man whose Bible Earl has carried every day for 45 years. He turned to face the crowd directly. "This is what service looks like," he said. "Not ribbons on a chest or stars on a collar. This is what sacrifice costs. A man who gave everything he had to his country, who lost his best friend and his wife and his connection to his own daughter, who ended up living under a bridge within sight of the base where he earned his trident." His voice rose with controlled fury. And this morning, Admiral Whitmore looked at this man and saw garbage. Saw something to be hidden away so it would not spoil his perfect ceremony. Saw a vagrant to be mocked and dismissed. Pierce turned back to Whitmore, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper that somehow carried across the entire deck. "You talked about standing on the shoulders of giants, Admiral." He pointed at Earl. "You were looking at one, and you did not even have the decency to ask his name before you tried to throw him away." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The cameras continued their silent recording, capturing a moment that would define careers and change policies and remind an entire service of what it meant to honor those who served. And Earl Vance Beaumont stood in the California sun, his tattoo exposed, his secrets revealed, feeling for the first time in 4 years like he might still be someone worth saving. The first movement came from the back of the crowd. A senior chief in dress whites, his chest heavy with ribbons from 20 years of service, rose from his seat and came to attention. His hand snapped to his brow in a salute directed not at the podium, not at Admiral Whitmore, but at Earl Beaumont standing exposed in the California sun. Then another sailor stood, and another, and another. It spread through the crowd like a wave, sailors and officers rising from their chairs in a cascade of white uniforms and crisp salutes. The veterans in civilian clothes stood with them, some saluting, others placing hands over hearts, all of them fixing their eyes on the old man in the faded flannel shirt, whose tattoo told a story more powerful than any ceremony could convey. Petty Officer Okonkwo was among the first. She had followed Earl up from below decks, had watched the confrontation unfold with growing emotion, and now she stood at attention with tears streaming down her face. She had worked with SEALs for 3 years. She knew what the trident meant. She knew what those coordinates represented, and she understood, perhaps better than most, what it cost a man to carry that weight for 45 years. The sound that filled the flight deck was not applause. It was something deeper, the rustle of fabric as hundreds of people rose, the soft shuffle of feet coming to attention, the collective intake of breath from a crowd that had just witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Earl stood frozen in the center of it all, overwhelmed by a recognition he had never sought and did not know how to accept. His eyes swept across the sea of standing figures, these strangers who had just declared their respect for a man they had never met, and something inside him cracked open. He thought of all the years he had spent believing he deserved nothing, all the nights under the bridge when he had convinced himself that his life had become worthless, that his service was ancient history, that the man who had earned those medals and that Trident had died somewhere along the way and left only a shell behind. But these people were not saluting a shell. They were saluting what he had done, what he had sacrificed, what he had carried. They were saluting him. From a crowd, a figure pushed forward. A man in his 50s wearing civilian clothes, his hair shot through with gray, his face weathered by years of sun and salt. He moved with the particular gait of someone who had spent decades on ships, and when he reached Earl, he stopped and stared with eyes that glistened. "Master Chief Beaumont," he said, his voice cracking, "you do not remember me. I was a boot ensign when you were an instructor at Coronado. Class of 1987. You taught me how to calculate windage without a spotter. You taught me that the shot you do not take is the one that haunts you forever." Earl studied the man's face, searching for the young officer he had once known. The years had changed them both beyond easy recognition. The man continued, "You washed out half my class because you said it was better to fail in training than die in the field. I hated you for it at the time. Thought you were the hardest instructor I had ever seen." He paused, his voice steadying. "Then I deployed. Then I understood. 3 times in my career, I survived because of something you taught me. 3 times, I came home to my family because of you." He came to attention and saluted. "I made captain before I retired," he said, "and I never forgot who made that possible. Thank you, Master Chief, for everything." Earl returned the salute, his hand trembling. The words he wanted to say lodged in his throat, too large and too raw to escape. Before he could find his voice, another figure approached. Then another. A line was forming, men and women who had served, who had trained under Earl, or served alongside men he had trained, who had heard the stories or lived them. One by one, they came forward to pay respects to a legend they had thought was lost. A retired commander who had served with SEAL Team 4 during the Panama invasion. A Master Chief who had been Earl's student in 1979 and gone on to train 2 generations of frogmen himself. A young lieutenant who had never met Earl, but whose father had served with him in Vietnam and spoken of him with reverence until the day he died. The stories poured out. Memories long buried resurfaced in the presence of the man who had shaped them. The flight deck became a reunion of warriors, rank and protocol dissolving in the face of something more primal and more sacred. Through it all, Admiral Whitmore remained on the podium, abandoned and irrelevant. The ceremony he had planned with such precision had been transformed into something he could not control, could not stop, could not salvage. His career was unraveling in real time, captured by cameras that would broadcast his humiliation to the world. But no one was looking at Whitmore anymore. They were looking at Earl Beaumont, the ghost who had finally stepped back into the light, the legend who had been living under a bridge, the father and grandfather who had lost his way but was slowly, impossibly, finding it again. Pierce stood beside him through it all, a silent guardian ensuring that no one interrupted this moment of recognition that was 45 years overdue. When the line finally thinned, he placed a hand on Earl's shoulder. "Welcome home, Master Chief," he said quietly. "It has been far too long." Earl looked at the sea of faces surrounding him, at the salutes still being held, at the tears flowing freely down weathered cheeks. And for the first time since Loretta died, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he still had a place in the world. Maybe he still had a home to return to. The ceremony never resumed. What had been planned as a formal change of command became something else entirely, a spontaneous gathering that no protocol could have predicted and no officer could have ordered. The band remained silent. The speeches went undelivered. The careful choreography of naval tradition dissolved into something messier and more human. Admiral Whitmore stood alone on the podium for nearly 10 minutes before his aide finally approached and whispered something in his ear. The Admiral's face went through a final transformation, from defiance to resignation to something that might have been the beginning of shame. He stepped down from the platform without another word and disappeared below decks. His career effectively ended by a confrontation he had initiated and could not survive. No one watched him go. Pierce took charge of the situation with the easy authority of a man who had commanded in chaos far worse than this. He spoke briefly with the outgoing and incoming commanding officers, both of whom agreed that the formal ceremony could be rescheduled. What was happening on this flight deck was more important than any transfer of authority. The crowd had reorganized itself around Earl, forming loose clusters of conversation and remembrance. Stories were being shared, connections discovered, the invisible web of military service revealing itself in unexpected ways. A retired chief who had served with Earl in Vietnam found himself talking to a young petty officer whose grandfather had been in the same platoon. A widow whose husband had died in Fallujah learned that Earl had trained the SEAL who carried her husband's body to extraction under fire. Earl moved through these encounters in a daze, shaking hands, accepting embraces, listening to stories he had never known existed. Each person who approached him added another thread to the tapestry of his service, showing him the ripples of a life he had thought ended in failure. Petty Officer Okonkwo found him during a brief moment of solitude near the ship's island. She approached cautiously, uncertain of her place in this gathering of legends. "Master Chief," she said, "I wanted to apologize. When I first saw you this morning, I did not know. I should have said something when Admiral Whitmore was treating you that way." Earl shook his head. "You did say something. You went to Admiral Pierce. You asked the right questions." He managed a small smile. "That took courage, petty officer. More courage than staying silent." She straightened slightly at the words. "I serve with Team 7 support," she said. "Corpsmen. I have seen what those men carry. What cost them." She paused. "I have also seen what happens when they come home and no one understands." Earl nodded slowly. "The hardest battles are not the ones we fight overseas. They're the ones we fight with ourselves after we come back." Before Okonkwo could respond, Pierce approached with his phone in his hand. His expression had shifted, carrying something new beneath the authority. "Earl," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Earl turned to face him, bracing for whatever news was coming. After everything that had happened today, he was not sure he could absorb much more. Pierce held up the phone. "The ceremony footage is already spreading online. One of the news crews uploaded their raw footage. It has been shared thousands of times in the last hour." Earl's stomach tightened. The exposure he had avoided for 4 years was now global and permanent. But Pierce was not finished. Margaret saw it. The name hit Earl like a physical blow. His daughter, the little girl he had taught to ride a bicycle. The teenager who had argued with him about curfews. The woman who had held his hand at Loretta's funeral and begged him not to disappear. She saw it, Pierce repeated. She has been trying to reach the ship for the last 20 minutes. Earl, she is driving here from Arizona. She left the moment she recognized you in the video. She'll be here by tonight. Earl's legs nearly gave out. He reached for the equipment station beside him, steadying himself against the metal. Margaret was coming. His daughter, who had searched for him for 5 years, who had lit candles and named her son after him and never given up hope, was driving across the desert to reach him. There is more, Pierce said gently. She is bringing your grandson, little Earl. She wants him to meet you. The sound that escaped Earl was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. It was something broken and beautiful, the noise a man makes when the walls he built around his heart finally collapse. I do not deserve this, he whispered. After what I did, after disappearing like that, I do not deserve any of this. Pierce gripped his shoulder firmly. Deserve has nothing to do with it, Earl. That little girl loved you when you were a hero, and she loved you when you fell apart, and she loves you now, standing on this deck in clothes that do not fit. Love does not care about deserve. He pressed his phone into Earl's hand. She left a voicemail. I think you should hear it. Earl stared at the phone, his hand trembling. Around him, the flight deck continued its impromptu gathering, but the sounds faded to a distant murmur. His entire world narrowed to the small device in his palm and the voice it contained. He raised the phone to his ear and pressed play. The voice that came through was older than he remembered, carrying the weight of years and worry, but unmistakably his daughter. Dad. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. I saw you. I saw you on the news. I am coming. Do not go anywhere. Do not disappear again. I am coming, and I am bringing your grandson, and we are taking you home. Do you hear me, Dad? We are taking you home. A pause. Then, softer. I love you. I never stopped. Please be there when I arrive. Please. The message ended. Earl lowered the phone and wept. 3 weeks later, Earl Beaumont sat on a porch in Tucson, Arizona, watching the sun set over the desert mountains. The light painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, colors he had forgotten existed during his years beneath the gray concrete of the Coronado Bridge. The screen door creaked behind him, and small footsteps padded across the wooden planks. Grandpa Earl, a voice said, Mommy says dinner is almost ready. Are you coming inside? Earl turned to look at the boy standing beside him. 4 years old, with his mother's dark hair and his grandmother's eyes. Earl Thomas Beaumont, Jr., who had been nothing but a name and a hope 3 weeks ago, who was now the center of a world Earl was still learning to inhabit. In a minute, buddy, Earl said. His voice was stronger now, fed by regular meals and rest and the simple miracle of being wanted. Come sit with me first. I want to show you something. The boy climbed onto the porch swing beside his grandfather, nestling against his side with the easy trust of childhood. Earl pointed toward the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. You see that bright one there, he said. That is Polaris, the North Star. Sailors have been using it to find their way home for thousands of years. The boy stared up with wide eyes. Did you use it when you were in the Navy? Sometimes. Earl's arm tightened around his grandson. When I was lost, I would look for that star and remember which direction home was. He did not add that for 4 years he had refused to look up at all, that he had kept his eyes on the ground because the stars reminded him too much of nights on the porch with Loretta, teaching Margaret the same constellations he was now teaching her son. The footage from the Roosevelt had spread further than anyone anticipated. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 12 million times. News networks picked up the story. Veterans organizations issued statements. The hashtag Justice for Preacher trended for 3 days straight. Admiral Whitmore resigned his commission 1 week after the incident, his career destroyed by 7 minutes of footage that captured everything wrong with how he had treated a fellow veteran. The Navy issued a formal apology. The Secretary of the Navy called Earl personally to express regret and gratitude for his service. Earl had listened politely and said little. The apology meant less to him than the small hand currently gripping his finger. Margaret had arrived at the naval base 8 hours after the ceremony, having driven through the night with little Earl asleep in the back seat. She found her father sitting in the base chapel with Admiral Pierce, wearing borrowed clothes and a stunned expression. Their reunion was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no accusations, no demands for explanation. Margaret simply walked to her father, wrapped her arms around him, and held on as if she would never let go. "I am sorry," Earl had whispered into her hair. "I am so sorry, sweetheart. I thought I was protecting you by leaving. I thought you would be better off." Margaret had pulled back and looked at him with Loretta's eyes, fierce and loving and utterly uncompromising. "You were wrong," she said. "You were so wrong, Dad. But you are here now, and we're going to figure this out together." The weeks since had been a slow process of rebuilding. Earl had moved into Margaret's guest room, a small space with a real bed and a window that looked out on the mountains. He attended VA appointments that Pierce had personally arranged. He ate meals at a table with family instead of scrounging from dumpsters or accepting charity at shelters. Some days were harder than others. The nightmares still came. The guilt still whispered. There were mornings when he woke reaching for Loretta and found only empty sheets. Afternoons when the weight of all he had missed pressed down so heavily he could barely breathe. But there were also moments like this one. A grandson on his lap, a daughter humming in the kitchen, a sky full of stars that he was finally allowing himself to see again. The screen door opened again, and Margaret stepped onto the porch. She leaned against the railing and watched her father and son together, her expression soft with a hope she had carried for 5 years. "You know," she said quietly, "Mom used to tell me that you were the strongest man she ever knew. Not because you never fell down, but because you always got back up." Earl met his daughter's eyes. "Your mother was too kind to me." "No." Margaret shook her head. "She was exactly right. It just took you a while to prove it." She reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Dinner is ready. Your grandson has been talking all day about showing you his shark books after we eat. Apparently, you are required to learn the difference between a great white and a tiger shark before bedtime." Earl laughed. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed and roughish, but it was real. "I think I can manage that," he said. He rose from the swing with little Earl still holding his hand and followed his daughter inside. The house smelled of roasting chicken and fresh bread, scents so ordinary and so precious that they made his chest ache. Before he crossed the threshold, he paused and looked back at the sky. Polaris hung steady above the mountains, fixed and faithful, the same star that had guided sailors home for millennia. "Still here, Ronnie," he whispered, "still trying." Then he stepped inside, into the warmth and light of a home he had thought he would never have again. Behind him, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, keeping their ancient watch, patient and eternal, waiting for all the lost souls who had yet to find their way. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching.